Well, good afternoon and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series, our premier digital educational platform featuring a variety of interactive programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where your team needs it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA, and as always, I'm very excited to welcome you all to another edition of our longest running NCIA Committee Insights series, today being presented by NCIA's Cannabis Manufacturing Committee. One final note to all those guests who are joining us for the live stream on Facebook, make sure to follow that short link in our video description, secure a spot in today's session, and interact with all of our amazing audience members and panelists alongside each other. Now, let's get this show on the road. In today's program, members of NCIA's Cannabis Manufacturing Committee will present a session entitled How to Increase Product Safety When We Don't Know What Safe Is, in which they'll discuss how to make manufactured products safer than the alternatives to provide a holistic harm reduction benefit. They'll specifically review how terpene limits, both in edibles and inhalables, as well as vapor products, can be manufactured so as to place them as low as reasonably possible on the risk continuum. Well, I know our panel is eager to dive into today's discussion, and our audience is interested in having their answers or their questions answered along the way. So let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome back our moderator for today's session, Ramon Alarcon, the founder and CEO of Wellness Insight Technologies, to the virtual stage to kick things off by introducing our panel of edible, ingestible, and inhalable cannabis manufacturing experts. Welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials, Ramon. Great to have you back. How are you doing today?
Thanks. Happy to be back.
Fantastic. All right. Well, you can take it away from here by introducing Arnaud and Lior alongside each other and kick things off.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So just really quickly, like Brian mentioned, I'm founder and CEO of Witty, technology company, bringing the connected health revolution to botanical medicines. And this year I've had the great fortune to be, part of the NCIA team, leading the CMC committee on product safety. Had a lot of experience coming into it, working for over a decade at Blue E-Cigs, going through 2 big tobacco acquisitions, launching 20 some odd products, and participating just in the evolution of that industry, and then also helping with industry standards, for example, the UL standards in terms of battery safety for e-cigs. So hopefully I've brought a lot to the table, but I've also learned a lot. And I'd like to ask my my co-presenters here to introduce themselves. First, Lior Cheda, sorry.
Hey, Ramon, thank you.
Hi.
Excited to be here. About myself, I'm Lior. I'm the R&D manager at IBNA. IBNA is a technology company and a terpene manufacturer serving the cannabis industry for more than 5 years now. We produce high quality terpene formulations, and we've been helping brands pretty much introducing great products to the market. And we put safety on the forefront of our product. So I'm very excited to be here and to help out more brands and more companies in figuring out this great challenge of using raw ingredients the right way and in a safe way.
Great, thanks. Arnaud?
Hey everyone. Thank you for the intro, Ramon and Brian. Very happy to be here. I am co-founder and CEO of the Blink Group, but also chairman of the ISO standards on vaping products and chairman of the European SEN standards for vaping products. We manufacture hardware with the Blink Group, hardware specifically for cannabis, and have really brought over the wealth of experience we've gained since 2009 in nicotine vaping over to cannabis. Little side note, I personally quit smoking when I encountered my first nicotine vaping device in 2009, and have actually been working in the industry ever since, advocating for harm reduction and product safety. So very happy to be talking about these subjects with you today.
Great, thank you. All right, Brian, you want to take it back for a minute?
All right. Well, we're ready to get started with the discussion. And so let's dive right into the slides here. So first slide is, what is harm reduction, Ramon? So let's dive into that before we go into the rest of the program.
Great. Yeah. So thanks for asking. Very nice setup. Yeah, so the idea is, you look, we have years of research and study left ahead of us in the cannabis industry. And, it really wouldn't be appropriate to call most manufactured products safe. And in most cases, we literally can't say what safe means in absolute terms. So should we all pack up, go home, stop selling products until the data is in? Well, of course not. Safety is relative. And we know enough now today to make manufactured products safer than the alternatives. In other words, provide a harm reduction benefit. So next slide, please. Um, so what is harm reduction? Well, it's a very well-established principle among health experts in the world of tobacco, for example, which is an area, like I mentioned, I have personal experience having developed blue e-cigs, and actually having had a front row seat to the birth of PMTA regulation with the FDA. And in tobacco, history shows that, like with many other things, this will sound familiar, prohibition doesn't work, right? So we weren't comparing safety of new tobacco products against some absolute zero. We're comparing it against smoking cigarettes. And you can see on the far right of this particular graph here that all forms of combustible tobacco are more harmful than the other nicotine alternatives. And they're worse, not because of the nicotine, but all the toxic chemicals associated with combustion. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a list of some of these HPHCs, or harmful or potentially harmful constituents. And you can see on the left-hand side of the graph that e-cigs, sprays, patches, these can be 95% less harmful. And that's substantially because they don't contain these HPHCs. And net, that represents an incredible health benefit to society. Next slide, please. And here's a closer look at comparing e-cigs to combustibles. I know this is a lot of data. Don't freak out. We'll you won't be tested on it. But if you just look at the first column of data, that's carbon monoxide. It's not highlighted, but it's got the CO label. E-cigs produce essentially zero carbon monoxide compared to about 20 some odd milligrams in a cigarette. Think about that. 20 milligrams is the same mass as a typical CBD dose for some people. That's an appreciable mass. That's an appreciable amount of substance, right, that you're taking in. And we have a similar situation if you look at the second column that has the red brackets around it, which is carbonyls. And in some some of these emissions from e-cigs, they're actually the same as the air blank. And that what that means is that's just the ambient air. So in some regards, they're very barely distinguishable from the ambient, the background measurements of these things in the air. And finally, on this slide, I just want you to take a quick look at the chemicals highlighted in note C. Isoprene, benzene, toluene, styrene. Remember those as we flip over to the next slide now. All right. So in table 1, you see some of those same chemicals identified in the emissions of cannabis vaping products. Now, the good news here is that those levels can be similarly very small in cannabis vape products. And take my word for it, these numbers, some of these numbers here are similarly very small, same order of magnitude as what you saw on the prior slide. But even given that, I can't tell you what a threshold level should be for some of these chemicals in an inhalation pathway, right? And similarly, I can't tell you how harmful smoking a pre-roll is. We don't know exactly how much a particular terpene is too much, or what the risk is when you heat formulations with particular terpenes. And the principle isn't just limited to vapor. I know I've talked a lot about vapor, but for example, can chronic use of a product, a topical product with a very high level of terpene, could that result in a skin irritation? But I don't have to know all this today. That's not where the industry is right now. And we don't live in a world with zero harm potential. So if we just look at table one again, you can see that there can be orders of magnitude difference. For example, even within these products, when you're talking about dabbing using a hot nail versus a very well regulated, thermally regulated vapor device. And then looking at table two down in the bottom right, you can compare the best vaping configuration against smoking flower. And here it's really enlightening. You see 5 to 6 orders of magnitude um, in hazard reduction. Now these numbers, these are just one study, and there's a lot of work to be done on the actual numbers, but the principles and the directions apply, and they're very compelling, and especially for products that some people use daily as medicine. And maybe someday we can determine what is deemed to be safe. But until then, we at least know these vectors, these directions that we can recommend, and the areas to exercise caution. So I hope this gives you a little bit of context for the material that'll follow, and help you understand approach for product design safety. And there certainly are limits to how we can message safety to the public. But even though you can't advertise products as being safe, if you're making a vape product, you're likely producing less harmful emissions than smoking flower, right? And if you're making edibles, the same is very much true, right? And I believe it's important to be able to communicate these benefits to consumers to promote the growth of manufactured cannabis products. So, and I also think this will give you a framework for a language that you can leverage when talking to regulators. Um, if you come across them in your daily life, and advocate for manufactured cannabis products. By and large, a lot of regulators will speak the language of harm reduction. And if you come speaking that language and you have data to back it up, perhaps we can head off some potential bad regulation in the future. So now that I've given you that framework, I'm going to hand it over to Lior to go into a little bit more depth about what we do and don't know about terpene safety, and then she'll pass it along to Arnaud. But before we do that, we have a quick poll for you about terpenes. So I'd like to, great, looks like it's up on the screen now. Take a quick 30 seconds, fill out the poll. This is about terpenes, what products you make, and how you use terpenes in your products. So if you just take a quick 20 more seconds or so to go ahead and fill that out, and then we'll share these results. I don't know if we want to share them at the end of Lior's segment before we transition into Arnaud's.
All right, thank you. So before I start to dive into the safety of terpenes, I would like to touch on several points for thought. The first is that terpenes are natural bioactive molecules that are abundant in nature and in many plant species. More specifically, terpenes are the main constituents in the essential oils of the plants. In cannabis, they're found between 1 to 5%, where in other plants, it can even range up to 10%. Some plants, such as clove, are very rich in terpenes and can get up to these percentages. Another point is that most terpenes are generally recognized as safe. In short, it's GRAS. It is a status label assigned by the FDA to compounds that are not known to be hazardous to health and is approved for use in foods. In addition, terpenes for cannabis applications are recommended to be food grade and should have the supporting documentation to back that up. The definition of food grade means that it's safe for human consumption and that is suitable to come into direct contact with food products. And finally, terpenes are common ingredients that are used in several industries, such as the flavor industry, cosmetics, as well as the e-cigarettes industry, also from what Ramona just told us. Therefore, there's information on the safety of Brian, not yet. Let's hop on to, yeah, sorry. There is a lot of information on the safety of terpenes in these industries. And in my presentation, I will present to you sources that can be used for determining the safety use of these terpenes. And one of the most recent industries to utilize terpenes is the cannabis oil-based products, which we use terpenes for both functional and flavoring purposes. However, the safety guidelines for these products are less clear, and that's exactly why we're here today and what we will define together throughout this presentation. Next slide. Perfect. So I wanted to touch on the routes of administration. Routes of administration plays a significant role in the bioavailability and dose decisions of terpenes. The three most common applications is in the cannabis industry is topical application, inhalables, and ingestibles. So as you can see in the topical application, terpenes enter the bloodstream transdermally with known bioavailability of around 0.1 to 12%. Inhalation has a very good bioavailability of around 60%. And the added value in inhalation is that there is also a trigger of the olfactory system, which then activates the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that is involved in our behavioral and emotional responses. And finally, ingestion of terpenes is not the most efficient way to absorb terpenes because of the acidity and the digestion that the terpenes are exposed to. Therefore, it has relatively low bioavailability, around 15 to 20%. And a more effective oral delivery method is a sublingual delivery, where the terpenes can get absorbed under the tongue and is suggested to have higher bioavailability. And to the next slide. So when we decide to infuse terpenes in products, the main factors that should be considered are what effect are we targeting, or even are we even targeting an effect, or are we mostly focusing on the aroma and flavor of the product? And most importantly, we want to consider safety and to understand what is the safe limits of terpenes in the product. So the balance between these three factors must be determined for each product depending on what terpenes go in and for what application. And it is important for me to mention that the final decision on the terpene limits in the products is the sole responsibility of the manufacturer. And the tips that I will give throughout this presentation are not official use recommendations. Next slide. Thank you. So we will start to talk about inhalables. Next slide, please. So the bioavailability of terpenes via inhalation is efficient, as I mentioned before. Because terpenes are volatile molecules, they actually start evaporating in room temperature. So they don't need high temperatures in order to be absorbed efficiently through the lungs. That's why using temperature adjustable hardware is highly recommended, also because it can lower heat byproducts and toxins. And I believe Arnaud will talk more about it in his next session. And as for dosing, we can use several references and sources that can help us out. The first reference is the natural ratios of terpenes in the cannabis plant. So that can be used as a great base guideline for terpene infusion, since the cannabis plant has been inhaled by consumers for many years and is still considered a safe plant for inhalation. And in addition, from our clients' experiences, the addition of terpenes at around 1 to 5% can also decrease the viscosity of the extracts, which may be required for some vape hardware and consistency purposes. And an upper limit can be referenced from the OLCC, which is the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, with a suggestion of an upper limit of 10% terpenes in inhalable products. And the final reference actually comes from the e-cigarette world. A position paper by Anik was published with suggested infusion percentage of terpenes in e-liquids. And as you can see here, they reference each terpene individually. And that's because each terpene has its own safety margin. So it's important for you to be aware of the exact terpene makeup of your product. And they calculated this limit according to each terpene's toxicity, as well as the frequency of puffs a day of e-cigarette users. So it is important to say that there's a big difference between frequency of use between e-cigarettes and cannabis users, where cannabis users takes around 9 puffs a day, where e-cigarettes users take around between 200 to 500 puffs a day. So please keep that in mind when looking at these numbers and reading that report. And on to the next. So moving on to ingestibles, we can move forward. So terpenes oral bioavailability is between 15 to 20%. The terpenes can be bioavailable within half an hour after intake and peaks around 2 hours after ingestion. Some methods such as sublingual and microencapsulations are commonly used in order to increase the bioavailability. The suggested range of terpene content in ingestibles is between 0.01 to 2%. And that again depends on the product and the frequency of use. So some good guidelines can be found in reports such as from FEMA. FEMA is the Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association, and they developed great guidelines for use of flavoring compounds in different food types. So you can see here in the table some examples that I pulled out from the report of different terpenes that are used for different food products. For example, we can look at the lime terpenes, where the average maximum amount in non-alcoholic beverages is 750 ppm, where in alcoholic beverages, it's a bit more, where it's 1000 ppm. Now, this example presents the dosing techniques for different types of products according to the frequency of use and average product serving size. So for example, non-alcoholic beverages mostly come in bigger bottles and are consumed more frequently compared to alcoholic beverages that are consumed in smaller quantities, and therefore higher amounts of terpenes can be there. So a general rule of thumb here is the lower the serving size and frequency of use, the higher the terpene content can be. And finally, my last point here is keep in mind that the frequency of use of cannabis edibles is much lower than regular foods that we consume on a daily basis. So keep that in mind. On to the next slide. So finally, I want to talk about terpene limits and topicals. Terpenes transdermal bioavailability has been shown to be around 0.1 to 12%. It reaches maximum plasma levels within 10 minutes after application. Terpenes are common ingredients in topicals and cosmetics, and they have special added value in cannabis topicals, especially because they enhance the transdermal delivery of cannabinoids. In addition, they have many other dermal benefits, such as anti-inflammatory, wound healing, and antioxidant properties that can be used for great anti-aging products. And like any other cannabis product, topical products should be properly stored and packaged in order to prevent terpene oxidation, because the oxidation of terpenes can cause byproducts and may increase the risk of skin reactions. And finally, because some terpenes are known as dermal irritants, their concentration in the final product must be carefully controlled. So guidance from sources such as IFRA, which is the International Fragrance Association, contains recommendations for the safe use of fragrance ingredients. And what we can observe in this table, some numbers that I pulled out of this great database, we can see that again, the terpene limit really depends on the product type. So let's take, for example, the citronellol example, where you can see that the lip product, which is considered a leave-on face product, the recommended percentage is 2.2, where body lotion has higher limit of 12%. That's because it's for the rest of the body, not the face. Where body wash, which is all the way to the right, has a terpene limit of 24%. That's because it's considered a wash-off product, and that's any product that you apply and then wash it off right away. And that's why higher terpene limits are allowed. So the leave-on products versus the wash-off products have great crucial differences in terpene limits. And again, as you can see here, each terpene has its own limitations. And that's why it's important to ask your terpene manufacturer for the list of ingredients and the transparency of terpene makeup, so you can be responsible and know the limits of your products. And that's it. I hope my insights were helpful, and looking forward to hearing your questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lior. Sorry to cut you off if I did, Ramon, but I think we want to share the results for the terpene concentration poll that we shared earlier and see if they jive with Lior's comments that she just delivered. So we're going to get those shared. And Lior, if you wanted to make any remarks on the results before we go to Arnaud, feel free. If not, we can dive deeper into it in the Q&A section as well.
Yeah, I think we can go over it in the Q&A. Overall, it looks great. I'm loving the results.
Perfect. Fantastic. Well, great to see that the audience was already in line with the remarks that were going to be delivered in advance. So that sounds great. And if you have any additional questions on those results, please do dive deeper into that in the Q&A board. All of you have the ability to post questions that are then publicly viewable to everybody else. So as you see questions populate that Q&A board, please do head over there and upvote any questions that you want us to dive into first. Okay. And with that, I think we're going to move on to the next section of the program, vape hardware design and testing to maximize harm reduction. Arnaud is going to take the lead on this section, and I think that we have a live poll that goes in line with this section as well. Just trying to get a quick read from the room about what you're most concerned about as it relates to harm reduction. Is it the extract safety, the hardware safety, or is it a combination of the two? So we're going to give this another 15, 20 seconds or so. Brooke, if on the back end you see a critical mass get hit, just share the results, and I'll turn it right over to Arnaud when those results get shared.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what I was hoping to see, because every combination has its own potential safety results. So let's first start with a very simple question, and I'm sorry if it's simple, but I still see a lot of people in the industry not understanding that the product we are selling is not just the extract or not just the hardware. The product that is being sold in the legal cannabis industry is the hardware plus the extract, the combination of the two. You can have the best extract. If your hardware has any issues, the product, the consumer experience will suck. Same thing the other way around. You can have the best hardware. If your extract isn't safe, the consumer experience will not be safe and will not suck. Basically, testing the extract is definitely not enough. It makes sense when you think about it. What people are putting in their lungs is the quote unquote vapor or the aerosol that comes out of these devices. It's not the oil itself. And that aerosol goes through a couple of different changes, because vaping is not only chemistry, it's also thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. Now, let's focus. I'm not going to focus on the extract part, because I think a lot of states and everyone understands how extracts are tested and what they're tested for. So, of course, pesticides, heavy metals, any kind of contaminants. Let's really dig into the hardware compliance. One concept to understand is the acidity and the pH level of these extracts. Now, I hear some people who say, well, it's an oil, you can't really measure pH. Well, there are companies that have devices that allow you to measure the pH of specifically oil. We've seen that the pH generally varies between 3 and 5, with a more acidic pH of 3 being mostly on the live resins and live rosins, and a pH of 4 to 5 being, I am sorry for this, I should have stopped. Excuse me, everyone. The pH really depends also on the terpene levels, because the terpenes are what bring this acidity to the extract. Now, with this acidity and these extracts that come into contact with every single component in a device, so you have a blown up picture here of a cartridge, for instance, you should know exactly what the profile of those components are. We call this the wetted material and wetted components. Those are the components that come into contact with that extract. You should understand all the potential leachability that happens with these materials. Some of the questions you can ask more broadly, for instance, from your suppliers are ISO 9001, ISO 13485, that's specific to medical devices, or GMP for these assemblers. We call them assemblers. They're commonly called factories because they don't actually manufacture any one of these components. They purchase these from subcontractors and then put them together. You should also ask for a full component list with every single material that is used in the hardware. There are certain FDA Title 21, CPG, and CFR standards and testing that you can use to understand what the leachability is for on glass, on silicone, on ceramic, on heating wire. All of that is very, very important to understand the interactions between the extract and the hardware. Finally, when you look at really the battery side, and that's when we're talking about the disposables or the variable voltage batteries, as Lior was stating, one of the important aspects of the entire vaporization process is the temperature at which these extracts are heated. Too high of a temperature, you're going to be burning those terpenes and burning those cannabinoids, thus creating degradants and VOCs that we just don't yet know about in the industry. So working with certified batteries, in the US, you cannot put a battery on the market if it's not FCC. And in the very close future, this is already the case in Canada, you can't put a battery, whether it's a disposable or a variable voltage battery or even a puff activated battery, on the market if it's not UL 8139 certified. And that is a reference to Ramon, who worked on this standard in the past. This standard has been advocated for by the FDA and will come into effect sooner than later in the US as well. What this does is it increases the cost, of course, of the product because a whole bunch of safety measures are put into place, like short circuit protection, overheating protection, cutoff times, a little vent hole in case there's any issue with the battery cell itself. It's very, very important to understand that your supplier, the people providing your hardware, are able to explain this. If they ask any questions about any of these list right here, it means they have no damn clue what they're doing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another aspect of the combination between the two, and this is a big part of use of cannabis products, is the vaping regimen. When we want to test for aerosol, like Colorado, for instance, who made this mandatory starting January 1st, 2022, the testing conditions should be used within range of how these products are actually being used in real life. Now, the key elements of a vaping regime or a puffing regime are the puff volume, the puff duration, and the puff frequency. One of the reasons we need this is to understand and create comparable results, because today, the very rare emission studies that are done with completely different protocols. One protocol, which is the Caresta CRM81 that you see on the first line of this table, is the protocol that has been developed specifically for nicotine vaping. Now, through a research piece that we have worked on with our partner LabStat in Canada and my dear friend Peter Josa, we were able to deduct from user-reported data what a specific cannabis vaping regime would look like. We have also decided to keep a baseline cannabis regime the same as the Caresta CRM81, so we can compare and harmonize between the two, since we already have a whole bunch of data using the Caresta CRM81. But what we've been able to pinpoint is that the puff volume is higher for cannabis users. The puff duration is higher. Now, going back to what Lior was saying, between 200 and 500 puffs a day for nicotine vaping, we all know that if we do that, or if any user does that with cannabis vaping, they're probably going to be lying on their bed for a better part of the day. We've trickled this down to about 3 to 5 sessions per day, with around 4 to 5 puffs per session. That brings us to anywhere on the high end between 20 and 25 puffs per day. So it's very, very smaller in terms of quantity of puffs than we have with nicotine vaping. That is why this, what we call the cannabis intense vaping regime, is more reflective of what users are actually, of how they're actually using these products. Next slide. Now, how do we do emissions testing? Basically, we have a couple of different ways of trapping this aerosol. As you can see in the diagrams here, and thanks Ramon for providing them, we have either a filter or an impinger that is filled with solvent. Obviously, the impinger will give a little bit more detailed results, but those are basically the two main trapping methods. A third one, which will give even more detailed results, but is quite expensive, is cryogenic trapping. Now, when we test the vapor itself, there are standards that exist out there. There's a standard that's mentioned right here, the ISO 27768, which is the routine analytical puffing machine. That is a standard that can be literally copied and pasted from nicotine vaping because it explains exactly how a puffing machine should work. There is a lot more research needed here, because we can trap as much aerosol as we want. We still don't know as an industry exactly what to be looking for. So why not start from the basics? What are we looking for in nicotine vaping? Let's already start with that. The metals, the carbonyls, the aldehydes, and understand exactly what we're seeing in these emissions. And finally, I'd like to attract everyone's attention to the fact that we need to be spending, as an industry, a lot more resources, whether it's manpower, whether it's lab equipment, or even funds, on understanding what the VOCs, what the degradants are during the vaporization process of cannabinoids and terpenes. We don't know that yet. There's such thing as Lior was stating, terpenes that are GRAS, but they are involved in food products. They are not certified for inhalation. We don't know how our body is equipped to inhale these and break them down. They're certified for skin use, they are certified for food products, but not for inhalation. We need to understand and do a lot more research as an industry on the different VOCs and degradants that come out of vaping products. If we don't do that, the regulator is going to do it for us. And guess what? The nicotine vaping industry went through this in the US. It is basically dead right now. No new products allowed on the market since 2016. As Ramon was talking about the PMTA process, there's only one product that has passed out of over 33,000 applications over the course of the past couple of years. So let's avoid making that same mistake and spend more time doing research on understanding what the emissions can contain, and most importantly, understanding the toxicology of these emissions. I rest my case. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, I think from here we're going to transition into a question and answer segment. So I'll have the other panelists, yeah, perfect, activate their video feeds. And then, as I've mentioned a few times throughout the program, don't be shy. Please post any questions that you might have either to the Q&A board, or if you're more comfortable sending them directly to the panelists in a direct message in the chat room, feel free to do so to either myself or Ramon, and we'll make sure to field those questions amongst this expert panel. Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to stop my screen share while we wait for some of those questions to come in so we can get some prominence on all of our panelists. Perfect. Well, don't be shy, everyone. We've got 22 people here in the session at the moment. So I know that there's some questions that are definitely in the back of people's heads. So as I turn it back over to Ramon, let those questions start flooding into the Q&A board. As we start to dive into the Q&A segment, Ramon, is there any sort of feedback or insights that you wanted to add on to either Arnaud or Lior's comments, or the submissions from the audience for either of those associated polls?
Yeah. Actually, there are a lot of I learned things, even myself, being on the committee. But I'll kind of kick it off with a question that you kind of prompted, Arnaud, which is we should be doing this other work, but it's not cheap. A lot, and we're trying to help product manufacturers, many of whom don't have deep pockets, don't have a lot of the equipment we're talking about. They that my prior life was part of a very big company that had tens of millions of dollars in research budget, and that's just not the fact of the situation here. But with that being said, either Arnaud or Lior, do you have any thoughts of, okay, if you're a smaller manufacturer, are there any practical things, any things you can do on a shoestring budget to take these steps? You have a product, you have an extract that might be changing from harvest to harvest, so your results may change, and it's maybe not manageable to test every single aspect. But are there any kind of first steps that we can suggest to the manufacturers to either look at the terpene safety or the product safety?
I mean, my major tips here is to, I think, as you said, consistency is very important. Documentation is very important. I think that receiving a certificate of analysis on the products that you buy, safety data sheets, list of ingredients on each and every product that you put into your final product is very crucial as a starting point, in my opinion. And as a responsibility, as a terpene manufacturer, we take that responsibility and provide that with each and every product that we send over. I think that this industry is really in its diapers, and now we're slowly developing the safety guidelines. And as you said, safety tests are very expensive, and and it's still very hard to translate them to actual human use. Even if we do toxicity tests on animals, it is, the exact translation to humans is not that easy. So it is a very complex question that I believe that, we're slowly getting there. IBNA is putting much effort into understanding toxicity. And we're hoping to also be able to share more insights pretty soon.
How about you, Arnaud? I know, back in my experience, we could do full panel analyses, but we found, for example, formaldehyde was a great stand-in. So, if you could just look at one thing to get a directional indication, formaldehyde was something you could look at without spending all the money on a full panel analysis, so that maybe you do a full panel analysis once, and then if you're making minor changes, you're kind of spot checking with just looking at formaldehyde. Now, I don't think that maps one-to-one in the cannabis industry, or we've identified what that marker is. But do you have any thoughts if there might be an analog that manufacturers could take advantage of?
I honestly, you actually nailed it. Formaldehyde. I mean, of course, it's not going to map one to one, but that is a perfect starting point. And it's something that I don't understand why no one has ever actually, or maybe a couple of people have actually started doing it, but no one has really done this full blown. I mean, that's very clear, and we can do it right now with the technology we have in the labs. I think as an industry, and most importantly as individual state players here in the U.S. That have their own associations, their own state associations, and there should be using anonymized data, so no bad feelings are hurt during this process. But we should put all of these products through a regular battery of tests that we would do for nicotine products. Um, just very basic information. We already have all the protocols, we have all the methods, and all the labs are able to do them today. If a couple of manufacturers, a couple of producers just pull together a couple of resources, it'll get done very easily, and it'll give empirical data to the industry while still being anonymized through a third-party lab, for instance, that there won't be any liability issues. I can tell you right now, I've spoken to a lot of companies and very large public LPs, for instance, that do not want to do them because they don't want to have this whole tobacco aura again and say, well, hey, what if in 20 years myrcene kills people and we have already preliminary data that says myrcene is dangerous? Well, if that's in our archives, then we could be subpoenaed to provide them and we'll be in trouble. I think everyone has that scare that we shouldn't have and that we can alleviate by doing anonymized third-party research, and pooled research. This is something that has been happening. Even the PMTA process for nicotine vaping companies, a lot of companies are applying together and getting that all of that research done, and it's reducing the cost. I think it's a very good idea, and I think as an industry we should advocate for getting more of these third-party controlled trials out there.
Yeah, I see Brian just popped into the chat an idea that came to mind for me as well, which is probably a good maybe a project for next term, for the next NCIA term for this committee. And if anyone in the webinar today has any other thoughts on things they'd like to see, maybe you don't have a question, but maybe there are some things that you'd like to see us work on, certainly reach out to us, pop it in the chat, whatever, because we are looking for things that we can help serve the industry with in the next term, which by the way, applications, just a little plug, Brian's smiling for me here. Yeah, a little plug. Applications are open, I think, through August 15th, if I'm not mistaken, to be part of the various NCIA committees for the next term. And
we do have a question from Halili Sharir.
Oh, we do. Let's see.
Your thoughts on clinical trials and safety stamp? Well, I'll start right now, but it's linked to the previous question that Ramon posed. Clinical trials are expensive and they take time. And most importantly, you need people to understand what a clinical trial is. I think we lack a lot of those profiles in our industry today. And but of course, that is coming down the road, whether we like it or not, because the regulators are going to ask for it. That we're going to need to have some clinical trials. We're going to need to have some research. When you think of it, we're the only industry where you can literally buy one piece of hardware off Alibaba. As soon as you get it delivered, you can fill it with an extract that you made in your garage, and you can legally sell it in certain states. When you look at that and you think about it that way, and when you have an aspirin maker who has to go through 3 years minimum of trial to put it out there, and it's just aspirin for a headache, you kind of see the difference in that process.
And looks like we do have a question from Ashley. Is industry already doing some of the work that we've talked about today, but keeping the results basically secret as IP? That's a great question. I wish we knew the answer to that. I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know if anyone else does. Our suspicion is that, yeah, I'm certainly in private labs, there's knowledge that's not being shared. And to the extent we can find a framework where there's look in the cannabis industry, it's not just on this type of data, but there's all sorts of data in terms of consumption data, how people are really using products, and that knowledge is out there and it's held in different places. But there really, as an industry, there are certain things we need to figure out how we share at least some of those. Yeah, protect the knowledge, the IP that we have, but find a framework where the entire industry can benefit, because we've all seen when negative things happen, they all negatively impact everyone, right? So the converse should be true, where when we have results, we have knowledge, we have positive things, we need to find a way as an industry to share those things without worrying, without stepping on IP, so that we can all kind of lift the entire industry.
Ramon, I think there's a good parallel here with Caresta. And this, everyone knows the story. Caresta was created specifically to do scientific research on tobacco, and the big tobacco companies are members of Caresta. But the big tobacco companies, they still do all of their research on their end too, even if it's replicated and triplicated by Caresta. It's still done in-house as well. I'm not advocating for one or the other, but it's going to happen in parallel for sure. We just need to make sure that as an industry, we do something as well on this front, because we don't want to replicate another master settlement agreement in 20 years.
Yeah. I have one question. I don't know if we're getting close on the time here, but Lior, is there a little bit different topic, but in terms of terpenes, are there any terpenes that worry you, that you would say to people really be cautious of? You mentioned that there are some you showed in one of your chart and one of your graphs where I think it was 7, 8, 9, 10% limit, others 0.1, 0.2. Just one little tidbit for viewers. Is there one that you would say, hey, be careful of this one and think critically about?
It really depends on which application. For example, for topicals, there are specific terpenes that are known to be strong irritants, and that's why they should be carefully used. For example, limonene. That's like a pretty irritating terpene for the skin. However, we use it, eat it, exposed to it all the time. But when you use it on the skin, it should be carefully considered. For the rest, I don't know. I mean, there's not one that that concerns me at all. There's because it's found in the plants that we consume so much. I can't even think of one terpene that really specifically concerns me.
Great. How about you, Arno? Any analogs in the vapor space where if there's one thing to leave people with, or like an issue that you've seen pop up recently that people really ought to have on their radar right now, and we kind of head it off at the pass?
I think it's mainly additives. I think these questions are coming up all over the place, as well as THC caps. Those are really the two. I mean, capping THC makes absolutely zero sense, because the biggest fundamental question about capping THC is access to youth. The problem is some of that youth actually needs that, the medical patients. And if you cap it, that youth is still going to go get it. It's like when you tell your kid not to do something, well, you can be sure that there's 95% chances they're going to go ahead and do it behind your back. And being French, I have to say this, when the legal drinking age in the US is 21, why do you think all the kids, as soon as they're in college, go binge drinking and end up in the hospital or in the police station? Whereas in my country, in France, kids start having a little bit of wine when they're 14, 16. They don't go out on binges when they're 18 and in legal age. So I think we're going to have the same issue with these THC caps. And finally, when you're limiting in a cartridge like this, when you're limiting the amount of THC, what are you going to put instead? Are you going to be putting additives that are being banned all over the place? Are you going to be trying to reincorporate hemp, or like Michigan yesterday that incorporated Delta 8? Are we going to be putting Delta 8 in there to compensate for it? I mean, seriously, it makes absolutely no scientific sense.
Yeah, I personally believe there's a range. I agree. I don't think bans are appropriate or caps are appropriate. But I do think there's a place. I actually look forward to a day where we've got a range of products where not every product is 80% concentrate THC potency. That we actually have a range of products that are all done well and responsibly, but artificially putting a cap on it, that kind of goes back to something I said, which is, prohibition doesn't work, right? And we've seen that in many industries, alcohol, tobacco, this industry. But that's kind of maybe a nice way to wrap it up, is prohibition doesn't work. And really the game from our perspective is keeping safety in relative context, and focusing on harm reduction. And, we do have a story to tell as an industry. Yeah, it's not like we want to put down flower. I mean, certainly flower has a place. So it's not like in the tobacco space where we had, cigarettes were clearly the devil, um, in a way. So we don't have that counter to counter, but we do have a story in our manufactured products about how we can make them safe. And if we can figure out how we can talk about the positive aspects of this, whether it be smell, mess, fuss, these kind of stand-ins for purity and safety, maybe there's a language we can develop, communicate to our consumers, and give them what we know is a safer product without necessarily directly disparaging flour, because that certainly has a role. Uh, but certainly we're here to talk about manufactured products, and we think there's a lot of positives to that. So maybe that's a great place to wrap up, unless anyone else has any other final comments.
I thought that sounded great. I'll take that. I'll take that pause from Leora and Arnaud's that they agree as well. I couldn't think of any way that we could have wrapped things up into the actual sort of theme of today's program better than tying it back up to the harm reduction approach. So I really appreciate you all, Arnaud, Leor, as well as Ramon, and all the other members of the Cannabis Manufacturing Committee over this last year. I've had a great experience working with all of you all to present some amazing educational content in our webinar program. And I'm really excited to hopefully be working with you all over the next few weeks as we gear up and prepare for the return of our in-person events and trade shows, and hopefully get to see and meet all of you all that I haven't met in person while we're showcasing some of your all's amazing educational content at those conferences. They will be taking place later this winter and fall in Detroit, Baltimore, and San Francisco, respectively. So if you have not marked your calendars for either of any of those events, please do head to NCIA's website, thecannabisindustry.org, after today's program wraps up, to learn more about the dates and all of the associated content and benefits that'll be surrounding those amazing in-person events later this year. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. A huge thank you once again to the members of our panel for presenting today's session, along with our audience members, and most importantly, our member business owners, which make our work possible each and every day. You'll all be directed to a short attendee survey after leaving the meeting room. Please do take 3 to 5 minutes to submit responses to that, as it will help us improve these programs as we start to wind down and gear up towards our in-person events later this fall. We'll leave you all with this end of event credit sequence, as always, highlighting the 50+ member businesses that participated in this afternoon's session and made up the Cannabis Manufacturing Committee membership for the current term. So with that, we look forward to seeing you all later this winter and fall at our in-person conferences and trade shows, and hopefully for another Industry Essentials educational webinar next week. Head to NCIA's website to learn more and sign up today. Thank you all so much. See you then.